more like how my channel typically focuses on the New Testament question. JM focuses on the Old Testament question. So, with that being said, I want to dive into just a little bit of Old Testament textual criticism. I haven't touched on it in the channel a whole lot, if at all. So you'll be the first. You'll be breaking in the Old Testament question. It's a heavy weight on your shoulders. Can you handle it?
Probably not, because not a text critical scholar, but
That's
I am a
okay.
very interested teacher of the Old Testament and the Hebrew
Yes.
Bible. So I have to deal with these questions.
Very good. Do you, first of all, do you read Hebrew? I wouldn't say, fluency isn't really the right word, but
No. Yes, I decipher Hebrew. My Hebrew
that's
is
very good.
probably intermediate level at best.
Okay.
I have not been in class in over 20 years, so I've had to maintain it on my own. My Hebrew is better than my Greek.
Mhm.
I'm trying to. I've used Biblingo some. I love what those guys do, and to get my Greek back up, and to keep my Hebrew. Uh, so I do it on my own, but my Hebrew is not. I can't fluently read Hebrew. I can
Okay, gotcha.
decipher and translate
Gotcha.
Hebrew.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good. That's good. I think that's probably most better than 99% of us out here. So I can sound out the letters. That's about as far as am with Hebrew. Much better with Greek. Anyway, so when it comes to the Old Testament, there are three major sources that we typically see Old Testament text come from. One is the Masoretic text, two is the Septuagint, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls. I guess technically the Latin Vulgate would be a source as well. So what's the relationship between these different texts?
Most translations use the what we would call the Masoretic text as their base. And the Masoretic text, largely, to my understanding, comes from the Leningrad Codex, and then maybe a few other codices that are consulted as well. The Aleppo Codex, for instance, a few others. For the most part, the Masoretes were really scrupulous, really careful. There's less fluidity among the manuscripts of the Old Testament than there is among the New Testament, because the Old Testament was copied almost exclusively by trained scribes, meticulously trained scribes, whereas the New Testament, by the time you get there, it's my understanding,
Mhm.
New Testament was getting translated by people who were trained as well as people who may not have been that well trained,
Yeah.
but they were, because the goal was to get the message out, get the text out. These are the words of the apostles, we got to get them out. So there was much less hesitancy to translate, and it just wasn't quite as meticulous as the Old Testament by the
Right.
time of the first century. So the Masoretic text, from my understanding, is the text that dates to the Tiberian Masoretes around 800, 900, 1000 AD. And
Okay.
that was the form of the text that had been passed along and finally sort of put in place by them. That's what all the dots on the letters are.
Okay.
Those are the Masoretes saying this is how you need to pronounce these letters, because Hebrew doesn't have vowels. It's a consonantal only language. There's
Right.
some consonants that do double duty, like in English we have Y, which is sometimes a vowel, A, E, I, O,
Yep.
U, and
Yep.
sometimes Y. Well,
Yep.
Hebrew has that, but for the most part, the Masoretes were the what how the text was interpreted in the early medieval period. Then
Right.
the Septuagint was the Greek. There's not really a Septuagint. It's just this generic term catch-all that was describes the Greek translations of the Old Testament. What we call the Septuagint, that's a little bit of a misnomer. There's not one Septuagint. There are Greek texts of the Hebrew Old Testament books, and those go back to the time before Jesus. So, but they're in Greek. They're a translation. And then lastly, you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are only been unearthed in the last, I don't know, 75, 80 years. And
Yeah.
those are the texts that were found at Qumran, where we believe the Essenes were based, and they were preserved there. They date also to around the maybe second century BC to second century AD, in that
Right.
window. So what you have are basically a Hebrew text that is earliest form is like 1000 AD, give or take. Greek texts that are eclectic, but they go back closer to the time of Jesus. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls in Hebrew that go back to around the same time as those Septuagint texts.
Right.
And Old Testament text criticism has to juggle those, has to sort through those, and there are places where they differ.
Right.
Um, and that's when the science of text criticism, it becomes similar to New Testament text criticism, but it's probably about a century behind.
Right.
People have been doing New Testament text criticism for way longer than Old Testament text
Right.
criticism. And Old Testament manuscripts, part of that was because after a scroll was deemed no longer fit for use, it wasn't kept around. It was buried, sometimes burned, sometimes it was, and a new one took its place.
Right.
You don't see that as much in New Testament text criticism. So there's just
No,
so many more variant manuscripts in the New Testament because there are so many more manuscripts of the
that's
New
right.
Testament.
Yeah. Another kind of thing that I've often heard when it comes to the Old Testament and the copying process is I don't know if you could shed some light on this, but some have suggested that later on in the Masoretic copying, that some of the Jewish scribes who would try to push people away from Christianity would change certain passages to make Christ look less like a Messiah figure than he actually was. Is there any truth to that claim?
That's a tricky one because, again, the Old Testament text didn't have vowels. And so a lot of these, what some people have called changes,
Mm-hmm.
are actually legitimate ways that the text could be read.
Right.
But they're not the way the Septuagint translators were reading it, for instance. So it
Okay.
becomes a question of, do you trust the Jews who translated the Septuagint texts, how they interpret it, or do you trust how the Masoretes encoded it or solidified it?
Okay.
Um, and which is many cases, they were doing polemics against Christians and vice versa. So
Right.
I don't like to say that. I think it's a caricature to say, well, non-Christian Jews changed the text.
Right.
Because for Jews, the text is super sacred. And you would not just change a text. There are many places. I mean, that's what if you ever hear of the term the Kethiv and the Koreh.
Yes. I was just about to ask you about that.
Kethiv,
Yep.
okay, so there are places where what is written and the Masoretes come to and they say, what is written here on the page, we don't know how, we don't know why, but it's probably not correct. They're probably it's like ancient text critical scholars, they were doing a little bit of that. And so they'll note it in the margin. They'll pull a circle and then you go over in the margin and the Koreh is this is saying this is how you should read the text.
Right.
Sometimes, most of the time, it's just slight changes in the spelling, defective spelling. So instead of a long O, which is with the Hebrew letter shurik,
Mm-hmm.
or sometimes called a holam vav, the long U is the shurik, the long O is the holam vav. It'll just be a holam, which is a dot, and so the vav will be missing. That kind of stuff. There's a lot of that. There are other times where it's kind of the scribes come to the word and it just doesn't make sense. Like I just preached through Habakkuk and I translated Habakkuk and have been doing a deep dive in it. Habakkuk, some of
Yep.
the hardest poetry in the Hebrew Bible.
Okay. Okay.
And there are places where the Hebrew text just doesn't make sense. And so
Mm.
the scribes have had to suggest, okay, what could this originally mean? Because somewhere along the way, something got messed up.
Right.
And the Septuagint will take it one way and others will take it another way. So yes, I would not say that. Maybe at some point some Jewish traditions gave the least Christian interpretation possible, but I
Right.
don't think you can say they changed the text
Okay. I
necessarily.
see. I think an interesting analogy in English that would work for English viewers to understand this question is the word live. So in Hebrew, I'm aware at least that certain words will change like their verbal form, for example, based on the vowel shift rather than the consonant. So if you don't
Right.
have the vowel markers, the little dots that go under or above the line, if you don't have those, sometimes it's ambiguous whether it's one form of the verb or another form of the verb. So
Yep.
in English, the word live, right? We would say live if it's a verb. I live, but if we use it adverbially, we would say live. I'm going like YouTube. I'm going live. So
Exactly.
the I is either long or short, depending on how the word is being used, whether it's an adverb or whether it's a verb. So I can't think of any instances off the top of my head, but there could be an ambiguity of whether or not something is meant to be adverbial or not. So you have the
Yeah.
same thing, but it's multiplied by 100 when it comes to Hebrew because that's the nature of the language.
Yes. Yes. And most translations, they will give, most modern English translations, they'll give priority to the Masoretic text, but they will say, but they don't slavishly commit to the Masoretic reading.
Right.
Because because the Masoretes weren't inspired, and sometimes they get it wrong.
Right.
Sometimes they break verses in the wrong place when it comes to poetry or a questionable, so
Yeah, yeah.
the Masoretes were ancient theologians and ancient text critics, but they weren't infallible. So
Right.
you have to take their, that's what I look at is I do think now there's some Christians on my channel that come at me and say the Septuagint should be our starting point because
Right.
that's what New Testament writers used. And I say, well, most of often they did use the Septuagint, but not always.
Right.
Sometimes they are using a different text than the
Mhm.
Septuagint. Whether it's the same as the Masoretic text, we can't say because Masoretic text is so late, but they were using something that wasn't the Septuagint. So I land on, you don't use the Septuagint as your primary starting point because by definition it's a translation, so it's one
Mhm.
step removed.
Yeah.
But you do consult it and heavily weigh it as you're trying to make sense of translating the text.
Yeah. Does
Yeah.
the Vulgate have much say in what's in Old Testament textual criticism, or is it kind of like seen as sort of tertiary?
Yeah, I don't give it hardly any consideration. I
Hmm.
think it was done by Jerome, so
Yeah.
it's already late. Um, it's the work of largely one person.
Right.
Um, I think it's interesting and it's a helpful way to see how
The church
Jerome
understood it.
translated
Yeah.
the text.
Yeah.
But yeah, I put it in like the later like when New Testament scholars are looking at manuscripts, and then they may look at a later Coptic or Syriac or Bohairic, like they'll look at them, but
Yep.
that's not their starting point.
Right. Right. So I'm going to shoot out a couple questions for you, and feel free to answer them however you feel necessary. All right. So, um, Mark 16:9 through 20, is that scripture or is it not?
I come down that it is not scripture. I think that it
Oh,
is early tradition, that it would be close to maybe how the Deuterocanonical books or some of the traditions about Jesus that circulated in the early church. So where I land on that is I don't, whatever it was, whenever it got incorporated into Mark's gospel, um, I, I, I'm confident saying it wasn't the Mark originally did not pin that. That's where I land on it. I know people would disagree, but
yeah.
I land that
Yeah.
if that's correct, if Mark did not originally pin it, then I don't think it can be used as inspired scripture
Mhm.
to build doctrine upon.
Right.
I think it can be used as edifying teaching of early traditions that circulated. But I tell in our Bible for the Rest of Us course, we look at that passage and I tell people don't build, don't have any doctrine that rests on this passage. So snake handlers, stop picking up snakes based on Mark 16.
Mhm.
That can't be corroborated anywhere else in scripture. And it's actually negated in First Corinthians in a roundabout way where God talking about don't test God as some did who were
Mhm.
destroyed by snakes, even though he's talking about thing in numbers.
Mhm.
That's where I land is don't build your doctrine on it, but it is early and it is important, and it is I mean, I read it as a culmination, almost like a condensed version of parts of the book of Acts that got added. And I have heard good arguments, like N.T. Wright, I think, argues that Mark's original ending was lost, and so that this was added on. I've heard other arguments that make a compelling case that Mark intended to end his gospel abruptly with the question to the women and them going off and not saying anything, which his readers would have known was not the end of the story, because the women did say something, because the gospel did get announced to the disciples, and Jesus did rise from. So I've heard good arguments for both. The argument that I find the least compelling is that it is original to Mark. But if it were to be shown as Mark's writing, I think it would have to be as equal with the rest of Mark's gospel. But until then, or in light of that, I don't think it can be. So I think translations that bracket it out are right to do it. I don't think they should erase it. But I think putting it either in a footnote or a separate section and then telling the readers, this is the history of this pericope, to me, that's the most responsible way to handle it.
Okay. So what I'm hearing there is that you need to go back into my videos and watch all of the stuff I've done on Mark 16, 9 through 20, and then come back and tell me if you change your mind. No. But that's the nature of the Catholic spirit, is we can have this discussion and not tear each other apart over it. So that's good. So sure. That's Mark 16, 9 through 20. Where do you stand on, I'm going to guess if it's the same, if this is your stand on Mark 16, 9 through 20, you're probably going to say the woman caught in adultery is also not inspired scripture.
Yeah, I think it's similar in that. Now, that one's different because it does appear in manuscripts of Luke. I think it even appears there. So I think it's an even older and an even more reliable tradition. I still fall short of saying it is inspired scripture. So I would say whatever this is, if you preach from it, you should only preach something that can be corroborated elsewhere in scripture from it as authoritative.
Right.
It doesn't conflict with anything we know about Jesus. And it's incredibly profound. And there are some wonderful lessons from it. So I think it should be included in scripture, but I do agree with translations that bracket it and say this text, like Mark, I mean, these are the two big ones. And then there's the Trinitarian verse in 1 John. Those are sort of the three big boys.
Yeah.
That's text criticism. I hold that those should all be treated the same way. Inform the readers of the history of the section. Let the reader come to their own conclusion, but make sure that they know all of the evidence and all of the arguments, both for and against it.
Right.
And like I said, I haven't been convinced that it's original to John, or I don't even say John. I take a different approach on, I don't think John, but I hold back. I come this close to saying it's scripture.
Right.
But I can't go because there's just too many questions about its origin. So I can't take it on tradition. Yeah. So okay, that's similar answer to Mark.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think most who would look at Mark 69 through 20 and John 7:53 to 8:11, most would say there's probably more external evidence in support of Mark 16 than there is in support of the pericope adultery. So it's interesting that you would see that come up as in a more stable tradition.
And again, let me qualify. I'm not a New Testament text critic, and I'm not judging just on external manuscript evidence. I'm also judging on internal coherence and how it fits with its surrounding and those kind of criteria. So I'm open to good arguments for why either would be included. That's where I land right now.
All right, very good.
I hold these conclusions with loose hands, but I do hold them at the moment.